The restaurant was alive with the soft clatter of plates and the low hum of conversations. Crystal glasses caught the warm glow of chandeliers, scattering little reflections across the polished wooden floors. Guests, dressed in elegant attire, whispered politely and occasionally laughed in refined bursts that seemed rehearsed, as if the room itself demanded a certain kind of composure. At the far corner, a grand piano waited silently, polished to a mirror shine, its black and white keys gleaming under the soft lighting. It had been placed there for the evening's entertainment, but the pianist had not arrived. The manager, a stern-faced woman with tight hair and sharper eyes, paced nervously, glancing at the clock on the wall. Each tick seemed louder than the last, echoing in her mind as the pressure mounted. The guests were beginning to murmur among themselves, subtle yet unmistakable expressions of impatience appearing on their faces. Among the staff, a young waitress moved quietly, her movements precise and almost rhythmic. She carried plates with steady hands, balanced trays effortlessly, and smiled politely when passing between the tables, always careful not to disturb the delicate atmosphere. Her uniform was simple, modest, and neatly pressed, and she wore her hair tied back so that it would not interfere with her work. No one among the guests noticed her much. She was part of the background, part of the scenery, yet there was something in her eyes that hinted at a depth of thought and a quiet determination. She had been working here for a few years, learning the rhythm of the place, the flow of service, and the unspoken rules of behavior that allowed everything to run smoothly. She knew when to step forward, when to step back, and how to move in a way that was almost invisible, yet perfectly efficient. The evening had started like any other, with guests arriving in small clusters, their voices polite, the air tinged with anticipation for the dining experience. Orders were taken, drinks were poured, appetizers delivered with careful timing, and the restaurant settled into a comfortable rhythm. The soft music that usually played from the piano had been replaced with an awkward silence after the no-show of the pianist, and now the absence was more noticeable than any background melody could have been. The manager's steps grew faster, her glances sharper, as if sheer willpower could conjure the missing performer out of thin air. She whispered something to one of the staff, a few quick words that carried urgency, but no solution seemed forthcoming. The guests began to look around. Some leaned toward one another, speaking in low tones, their expressions betraying curiosity and mild annoyance. A few tapped fingers against wine glasses, a subtle rhythm that was almost imperceptible but filled the waitress with a quiet awareness of the tension in the room. She had seen this look before in other settings, where expectation hung heavily in the air and disappointment was beginning to bloom. She moved among the tables, refilling glasses, clearing plates, offering gentle smiles and soft words, all the while aware of the growing unease around her. It was in moments like these that her mind wandered, as if the clinking of silverware and the muted voices created a backdrop against which she could think more clearly. And tonight, her thoughts were focused on the piano. She had learned to play when she was very young, though it had never been anything more than a private passion. Hours spent on the keys in an empty room, practicing scales and songs she loved, had become her escape from the ordinary and the expected. She never sought attention for her skill, never announced it, and had long accepted that it was a quiet part of her life, one that existed away from the scrutiny of others. Yet here, in this moment, she felt a strange stir of possibility. The empty piano, the watchful eyes of the guests, the tense energy of the room, it all seemed to call to her in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. Her hands trembled slightly as she wiped down a table near the piano, glancing toward the instrument as if it were a living thing, waiting to be coaxed to life. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing against her chest, a mixture of fear, excitement, and something else she could not name. The manager, unaware of the thoughts running through the young waitress's mind, moved closer to the piano herself, muttering under her breath and shaking her head. The staff exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do next, their training offering no guidance for such a situation. The guests had grown quieter, their attention subtly shifting toward the empty corner, the absence of music more pronounced with each passing second. The young waitress took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had never performed in front of an audience like this before, and yet a strange calm settled over her, as if the years of private practice had prepared her for some unforeseen moment. When all eyes would turn toward her, she felt a connection to the piano that went beyond mere technique or knowledge. It was as if the instrument understood her, recognized her, and silently invited her to play. She moved a step closer, her footsteps soft against the polished floor, and felt a small spark of courage. Her heart beat rapidly, but the nervousness was now mingled with anticipation, a sense that something important was about to happen. The manager noticed her hesitation and frowned. She did not know what the young waitress was thinking, but her gaze was sharp and questioning. The other staff looked on, unsure whether to intervene or simply wait. The guests began to murmur again, their voices tinged with curiosity and disbelief. And then, in a quiet, almost tentative voice, the waitress spoke, suggesting that she could play the piano. There was a pause, a moment that seemed to stretch endlessly, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Laughter, soft and incredulous, rippled through a few tables. Some guests raised eyebrows, others exchanged skeptical glances, and the manager's frown deepened. The idea seemed absurd. After all, she was a waitress, not a performer. And yet there was a quiet certainty in her eyes that made it difficult to dismiss entirely. The manager hesitated, weighing the risks and benefits in her mind. The pianist had not arrived, and delaying the entertainment further could upset the guests even more. After a tense moment, she nodded reluctantly, gesturing toward the piano and allowing the young waitress to take the stage. A ripple of surprise passed through the room, guests turning their heads to witness the unfolding scene. Some whispered, others simply watched with curiosity, and the staff exchanged uncertain glances. The waitress approached the piano slowly, feeling the weight of every eye upon her. Each step was measured, deliberate, yet she felt a strange lightness in her movements, as if some invisible force was guiding her. When she reached the piano, she paused, placing her hands gently on the keys, feeling the smooth surface beneath her fingers. The room was silent now, the clatter of dishes and muted voices replaced by anticipation. She took another deep breath, allowing herself a moment to center her thoughts and calm her racing heart. She could feel the eyes of the guests, the unspoken judgments and expectations, and yet she let all of that fade into the background. This was her moment, small as it might be, and she was determined to meet it with every ounce of focus she could muster. As her fingers touched the keys, a soft note filled the air, tentative and uncertain at first, but growing steadily in confidence and clarity. The guests shifted in their seats, some leaning forward, their expressions softening from skepticism to surprise. The sound was precise, controlled, and filled with a delicate emotion that seemed to speak directly to the room. The young waitress felt a surge of energy, a connection to the piano that seemed almost electric, as if the instrument had been waiting for her all along. She played another note, and then another, each one more confident, more expressive than the last. The music began to flow, a gentle current that moved through the room, quieting the murmurs and capturing the attention of every guest. The restaurant had become a stage without warning, and the young waitress, once invisible among the staff, was now the center of attention. The chandelier lights reflected off the polished wood and the gleaming keys, creating a visual harmony that matched the sound. Her movements were fluid, almost natural, as if her body and mind were perfectly synchronized with the piano. She played not for recognition, not for applause, but because it felt right, because the music demanded to be heard, and because she had carried this skill quietly, faithfully, waiting for a moment when it could be shared. Guests who had been poised, distant, and critical now leaned in closer, their curiosity evolving into genuine fascination. Eyes that had been skeptical softened, and mouths that had been pursed in judgment began to relax. The soft sound of her music created a bridge between her and the audience, dissolving the barriers of class, expectation, and routine. The manager, who had expected embarrassment or disaster, found herself drawn into the moment, watching with a mix of disbelief and awe. Other staff members, too, paused in their work, captivated by the unexpected beauty filling the room. As the first section of the music unfolded, the young waitress began to notice subtle changes in the atmosphere. Conversation ceased, laughter stopped mid-sentence, and even the soft scraping of chairs against the floor seemed to vanish. The piano was no longer a piece of furniture in the corner. It had become the voice of the room, and she was its messenger. She felt a profound sense of fulfillment, a quiet joy that transcended fear and hesitation. Every note, every pause, every gentle touch of the keys was an expression of a part of herself that had remained hidden, now revealed in a way that was beautiful and undeniable. The initial surprise of the guests gradually transformed into admiration. Some whispered to one another, questioning if they had been mistaken, while others simply watched in silence, unable to speak as the music wrapped around them. The young waitress played with increasing confidence, each note resonating not only through the piano, but through the hearts of those listening. She felt the subtle nods of approval, the small smiles, the glimmer of tears in a few eyes. Though she did not allow herself to be distracted, her focus remained on the piano, on the music, and on the invisible connection forming between her and the audience. For the first time that evening, the restaurant was united in a shared experience. Differences of wealth, status, and expectations seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a collective appreciation for something pure and human. The young waitress continued to play, unaware of how extraordinary this moment would become, lost in the music and the fulfillment of a hidden dream. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a musician, a storyteller, and a silent leader, guiding the attention and emotion of the room with nothing more than the skill and passion she had cultivated over years in quiet solitude. As the first part of the performance reached its gentle conclusion, the guests remained silent for a heartbeat longer than expected. The last note hung in the air, a delicate echo that seemed to linger indefinitely. Then, slowly, quietly at first, applause began to emerge. Some guests clapped softly, others with more enthusiasm, and soon the entire room was engaged, acknowledging the unexpected talent that had emerged before them. The young waitress, still seated at the piano, allowed herself a small smile, her fingers resting lightly on the keys. Feeling the warmth of the moment and the remarkable shift in perception she had achieved, she had stepped into the spotlight unexpectedly, and the room had responded in kind, opening its eyes and hearts to a talent it had never anticipated. This was only the beginning, but it was a beginning filled with promise, courage, and the quiet triumph of a skill long hidden but never forgotten. The room seemed to hold its breath as the young waitress remained seated at the piano. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a moment, feeling the smooth surface beneath them, listening to the echoes of the notes she had just played. The applause from the guests had been soft but growing, a hesitant recognition that something extraordinary was unfolding. She knew this was only the beginning. Each note she was about to play needed to count, needed to tell a story that had never been spoken aloud in the quiet corners of her life. Her heart beat faster, but a quiet determination settled in, guiding her as she prepared for the next series of melodies. The manager watched from a distance, still uncertain, still skeptical. Her frown had softened slightly, but disbelief lingered. She had never seen anything like this, a waitress stepping into the role of a performer, captivating an audience of the city's elite. The other staff members had paused in their duties, trays in hand, waiting to see what would happen next. Even the chefs, peeking from the kitchen doorway, had stopped their routine to catch a glimpse of the unfolding scene. There was a shared feeling of awe, a recognition that the ordinary rules of the evening had shifted into something unexpected and remarkable. The guests themselves were a mixture of emotions. Some were visibly shocked, their polite expressions giving way to genuine surprise and curiosity. A few leaned forward, trying to take in every movement of her hands on the keys, listening to the delicate rise and fall of the music. Others whispered to those beside them, voices low but filled with intrigue, questioning how a young woman with no formal announcement could command such attention. With just her skill and presence, there was a tension in the air, not of discomfort, but of anticipation. It was as if the room itself were waiting to see what would come next, eager to be moved, to witness something extraordinary unfold before them. She took a deep breath and let her fingers glide across the keys, playing softly at first. The notes were gentle, almost like a whisper, drawing the listeners in, inviting them to let go of their preconceived notions and simply feel the music. Each chord was deliberate, measured, filled with emotion that she had carried silently for years. There was a subtle complexity in her playing, a layering of melody and rhythm that hinted at her deep understanding of the instrument. The room transformed as the music flowed, filling every corner with a warmth that was both calming and electrifying. Guests who had been skeptical moments ago began to sit straighter, their attention fully captured. Some closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them, while others followed the movement of her hands with wide eyes. It was not just skill they were witnessing, it was emotion, vulnerability, and courage all wrapped into one performance. Each note seemed to carry a piece of her story, a silent confession of dreams long nurtured and moments of quiet practice. When no one else was watching, the piano had become an extension of herself, a voice that spoke for her without words. The young waitress felt a strange sense of liberation as she played. Every worry, every doubt, melted away under the weight of the music. She no longer felt invisible or ordinary. She was present, fully alive in the moment, and the audience could sense it. She played with a natural confidence, not because she had performed before, but because she knew the music, knew herself. and knew that this was her chance to be seen in a way she never had been. The connection between her and the room was tangible. It was as if the notes themselves carried a message that transcended social barriers, drawing everyone into the shared experience of the music. A few guests whispered among themselves, exchanging surprised glances. "Is she really a waitress?" one asked softly, as if speaking too loudly would break the spell. Another shook their head, disbelief mixed with admiration. The young waitress, focused entirely on the keys before her, did not acknowledge these murmurs, but the awareness of them only fueled her determination. She wanted to show, not boast, the depth of her skill and the passion that had been hidden away for so long. She wanted her music to speak for itself, to tell a story that words could not capture. The complexity of the pieces she chose demonstrated not only her technical skill, but also her emotional range. Some passages were lively and playful, evoking a sense of joy and spontaneity, while others were slow and contemplative, allowing the listener to feel the weight of her inner world. She played with subtle variations, dynamic changes, and delicate phrasing that revealed a maturity far beyond her years. It was clear that she had not only practiced the music diligently, but had internalized it, making it a part of herself so that every performance was infused with personal meaning. The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. The hum of conversations disappeared entirely, replaced by the resonant sound of the piano. Guests who had been tapping fingers impatiently now held their hands still, captivated by the unfolding performance. Some leaned closer to their companions, sharing quiet observations, while others simply watched in silence, unable to look away. The young waitress felt the collective attention of the room, but rather than being intimidated, she drew strength from it. She was not performing for applause or recognition. She was performing because it was the truest expression of herself at that moment. The manager, standing near the edge of the room, could hardly believe what she was witnessing. She had expected chaos or embarrassment, a disruption to the carefully planned evening, but instead, she found herself caught in the beauty and sincerity of the music. The staff, too, were amazed. Some exchanged glances, nodding slightly, sharing silent acknowledgement of the skill they had witnessed. It was as if the young waitress had created a pause in the usual flow of routine, forcing everyone present to recognize something extraordinary hidden within the ordinary. As she continued to play, the young waitress felt a growing sense of confidence. The initial hesitation and nerves had transformed into a steady rhythm, a flow that seemed to carry itself effortlessly. She allowed herself to experiment with subtle embellishments, small improvisations that added richness and depth to the music. The audience responded instinctively, leaning forward, closing their eyes, or letting a faint smile touch their lips. There was no applause yet, only the shared understanding that something remarkable was happening, a moment that would linger in memory long after the final note was played. She thought briefly of the countless hours she had spent practicing alone, nights filled with the soft hum of a lamp, the quiet tap of keys against fingers, the repeated effort to master scales and pieces until they became second nature. All of those hours, which had often seemed unnoticed or futile, had led to this very instant. And now, with the eyes of the restaurant upon her, those hours felt validated in a way she had never imagined. Every moment of doubt, every frustration, every triumph in private practice converged into this one undeniable truth. She had the ability to touch the hearts of strangers through music. The guests began to show subtle signs of their growing admiration. Hands that had been clasped together now relaxed, some faces softened. A few nodded along to the gentle rhythm she had established. Even those who had initially scoffed or whispered in disbelief could not deny the elegance and depth of her performance. The young waitress did not play to impress or to prove a point. She played because it was a natural extension of who she was, and that authenticity resonated with everyone in the room, creating an invisible bond between performer and audience. Her music told a story without words, one that spoke of hope, perseverance, and quiet strength. She played pieces that built gradually, allowing the melodies to rise and fall, carrying emotion with them. There were moments of tension, subtle and controlled, followed by gentle releases that brought a sense of calm and satisfaction. The dynamic range of her playing showcased her technical skill, but it was the emotional honesty of her performance that left the deepest impression. Every listener, whether fully conscious of it or not, felt a connection, an understanding that they were witnessing something profoundly human and deeply moving. The young waitress allowed herself to glance briefly at the faces around the room. She saw eyes wide with admiration, mouths slightly open in surprise, and subtle expressions of joy and wonder. It was a rare and humbling experience. To see strangers so openly moved by something that came from within herself. She did not seek their validation, but the knowledge that her music had touched them added a quiet warmth to her heart. It was as if, in that moment, the invisible walls that often separated people, the barriers of status, background, or routine had dissolved, leaving only the shared experience of beauty and emotion. The room had transformed entirely. The restaurant, once filled with polite chatter and quiet tension, had become a space of reverent attention. Guests leaned forward, held their breath during delicate passages, and allowed themselves to be swept along by the flow of the music. Even the staff, who had been caught off guard by the unexpected turn of events, found themselves participating in this shared moment of wonder. The young waitress, fully immersed in her performance, felt a sense of liberation that went beyond the notes she played. She was telling her story, sharing a piece of her soul, and the response from the room was immediate and profound. As she reached the climax of her piece, the intensity of the music built, flowing effortlessly from her fingers to the keys, and then into the hearts of everyone listening. The notes swelled, filled the room, and seemed to hang in the air for a moment longer than physically possible. Guests leaned forward, captivated, some closing their eyes, others holding their breath, all completely absorbed in the moment. There was a collective recognition of the extraordinary talent before them, a silent acknowledgement that they were witnessing something rare, beautiful, and unforgettable. Finally, the young waitress brought the piece to a gentle close, her fingers resting lightly on the last note. The room was silent for a heartbeat, the echo of the music lingering like a delicate fragrance. Then, slowly, almost hesitantly at first, the applause began. It started as a soft ripple, growing steadily until it filled the entire room. Hands clapped, some guests rose to their feet, and smiles of genuine admiration spread across faces that had been skeptical only moments before. The young waitress allowed herself a small, quiet smile, feeling a profound sense of accomplishment and connection. She had stepped into an unexpected role, faced the uncertainty of the moment, and emerged with grace, skill, and authenticity. The room had been transformed, and so had she. The room had settled into an almost magical silence after the initial applause, a quiet that carried both awe and anticipation. Guests who had once been skeptical now sat with open eyes and attentive expressions, as if waiting to see what would come next. The young waitress remained at the piano, her fingers hovering above the keys for a brief moment, listening to the faint echoes of her earlier performance. She could feel the weight of the audience's gaze, but rather than feeling intimidated, it gave her a sense of purpose. She was no longer merely part of the restaurant staff. She had become the center of the evening, the unseen story now revealed through music. Her hands moved delicately at first, caressing the keys with gentle precision. Each note carried a subtle nuance, a hint of emotion that could not be conveyed by words alone. The guests leaned forward, drawn in by the delicate rise and fall of her melodies. The music was soft, intimate, yet it held an unmistakable presence, commanding attention without demanding it. It was as if the piano itself had become a living entity, responding to her touch and communicating directly with those listening. The young waitress felt a connection to the instrument that went beyond technique. It was personal, emotional, and profoundly human. The manager, who had been tense and unsure moments ago, now stood rooted in place, watching the young waitress with a mixture of surprise and admiration. She had anticipated a disastrous turn of events, yet what unfolded before her eyes was something entirely unexpected. The staff, too, had paused their work, captivated by the beauty and skill of the performance. It was not just technical ability that impressed them, but the depth of feeling and the confidence that radiated from the young performer. Everyone in the room was experiencing a rare, shared moment, where the ordinary boundaries of life and routine were suspended by the power of music. The young waitress allowed her emotions to flow freely into her playing. She had spent countless hours practicing in solitude, honing her craft in quiet spaces where no one could witness her dedication. Those long nights, filled with repetition and patience, had prepared her for this moment, even if she had never imagined it would occur in such a public setting. Each note she played carried not only technical mastery, but also the story of perseverance, dreams, and the quiet strength that had always been a part of her. The music was no longer merely sound. It was a voice, a narrative that spoke directly to the hearts of those listening. Guests whispered to each other, their disbelief giving way to admiration. Some leaned forward, eyes wide, silently asking one another how a young waitress could possess such skill. Others simply closed their eyes, allowing the music to wash over them, to move them without explanation. The young waitress did not notice these reactions directly. Her focus remained entirely on the piano, on the music, and on the subtle interplay between emotion and melody. She played with the awareness that every note mattered, that each chord had the potential to touch someone in the audience in a way nothing else could. The complexity of the piece she was performing was subtle but undeniable. It was not a flamboyant display meant to impress superficially. It was a carefully constructed expression of feeling, a layering of melody and harmony that revealed depth and sophistication. She transitioned effortlessly between delicate passages and more robust sections, creating a dynamic ebb and flow that captured the attention of the entire room. The guests, many of whom had never experienced live music in such an intimate and personal way, were spellbound. Every nuance, every subtle change in tempo, seemed to carry meaning beyond the music itself. As she continued, the young waitress noticed the subtle reactions in the audience. Eyes glimmered with emotion, some moist with the quiet stirrings of sentiment, others bright with admiration. Hands, previously resting idly, began to tap softly in rhythm with the music. Though no one fully realized they were doing so, there was an unspoken connection forming, a recognition that what was unfolding before them was rare, authentic, and profoundly moving. She could feel it in the air, a shared understanding that transcended social roles, age, and background. The restaurant itself seemed to change. The usual noises, the clatter of cutlery, the murmurs of conversation, the occasional clinking of glasses had faded into the background, replaced entirely by the music. The grand piano, once a silent piece of furniture in the corner, had become the focal point, the voice of the evening, and the young waitress was the storyteller. Her fingers moved with both confidence and care, coaxing each sound from the keys with intention and grace. Every phrase she played was deliberate, measured, and full of expression, capturing the subtle emotional shifts of the music and the room alike. In the audience, there was a mix of reactions. Some guests were visibly moved, their faces reflecting the quiet intensity of the experience. Others whispered softly to companions, trying to articulate their surprise and admiration, but finding words inadequate. A few leaned back, eyes closed, simply allowing themselves to be carried by the music, transported beyond the confines of the restaurant into a space where emotion and sound intertwined seamlessly. The young waitress, fully immersed in her performance, felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She was not performing for recognition or reward. She was performing because the music demanded it, because it was the most honest expression of herself she could offer. The manager, once doubtful and tense, now watched with a mixture of awe and respect. She had underestimated the young waitress, assuming that her role as a server defined her abilities. And yet here was proof that talent and dedication could exist in unexpected places. The staff, too, shared silent glances, their previous worries replaced by admiration and a newfound respect. Even those who had initially doubted or questioned the situation could not deny the impact of what was unfolding. The young waitress had transformed the evening, the atmosphere, and the perception of those around her through a performance that was at once intimate and commanding. As the piece progressed, the young waitress began to experiment with subtle variations in rhythm and dynamics, weaving moments of tension and release into the music. She allowed herself to improvise slightly, guided by intuition and emotion rather than strict adherence to the written notes. The audience responded instinctively, drawn deeper into the performance, their attention unwavering. It was as if each note and pause carried a secret meaning, a silent communication between performer and listener that transcended language or explanation. The room was no longer just a dining space. It had become a shared emotional landscape, shaped entirely by the music and the authenticity of the young waitress's expression. The emotional resonance of the performance grew with each passing moment. The young waitress felt a profound sense of connection, not just to the piano and the music, but to the people in the room. She sensed their curiosity, their surprise, their admiration, and their quiet emotional responses. It was a reciprocal experience, each note she played eliciting an unseen response from the audience, which in turn inspired her to play with even greater depth and nuance. The music had become a dialogue, a conversation without words, where emotion and intention flowed freely between performer and listeners. The guests, previously bound by their own expectations and preconceptions, were fully immersed in the experience. The initial skepticism that had been so palpable when the young waitress first suggested she could play had completely dissolved. In its place was an unspoken acknowledgement of talent, courage, and authenticity. Some guests' eyes glimmered with tears, though they made no effort to hide them, moved by the beauty and honesty of the performance. Others nodded subtly, silently affirming the profound skill and emotional impact of what they were witnessing. The young waitress, aware of these responses only peripherally, allowed the music to guide her completely, trusting her instincts and the years of practice that had brought her to this moment. The grand piano seemed to respond to her touch, the sound resonating with clarity and warmth throughout the room. Each chord, each arpeggio, each gentle glide across the keys contributed to a narrative that was both personal and universal. The young waitress poured herself into the performance, not seeking approval, but rather sharing a part of herself that had long remained hidden. The audience, sensing the authenticity and vulnerability in her music, responded with quiet attention, their focus undivided, their emotions subtly aligned with the ebb and flow of the melody. As the music reached its climactic passage, the intensity of her playing grew, each note carefully balanced between strength and delicacy. The room felt charged, as if every listener were holding their breath, collectively participating in the unfolding story of the performance. There was a palpable sense of anticipation, a feeling that something extraordinary was taking place beyond the ordinary routines of the evening. The young waitress felt a surge of exhilaration, her fingers moving with a combination of technical skill, intuition, and raw emotion. The piano, the audience, and herself were united in a shared moment that transcended the usual boundaries of space, time, and expectation. Finally, she guided the music to a gentle conclusion, allowing the final notes to linger in the air. Delicate and resonant, the room remained silent for a moment longer, as if the audience was savoring the last traces of the performance, reluctant to let the spell be broken. Then, slowly, applause began to rise, tentative at first but growing steadily into a full, appreciative response. Some guests rose to their feet, others clapped with visible enthusiasm, and all were united in admiration for the unexpected talent that had emerged before them. The young waitress allowed herself a small, quiet smile, feeling a profound sense of fulfillment. She had faced the uncertainty of the moment, embraced it, and emerged with authenticity, grace, and a performance that had touched everyone present. In that moment, the restaurant, the audience, and the young waitress were transformed. The ordinary evening had become extraordinary, the familiar space filled with wonder and admiration. The music had revealed not only her skill, but also her courage, her dedication, and the quiet strength that had carried her through countless hours of practice. The impact of the performance extended beyond the room, leaving an imprint on every person who had witnessed it. The young waitress, once invisible among the staff, had stepped into the light, proving that talent and passion could emerge in the most unexpected places, capable of inspiring, moving, and connecting people in ways that words alone could never achieve. The applause had died down, leaving the restaurant in a calm that was different from before. It was a quiet filled with reflection, a stillness that allowed the music to echo in the minds of the guests. The young waitress remained at the piano, her fingers resting lightly on the keys, as if drawing strength from the instrument itself. She could feel the eyes of the audience upon her, but it no longer felt heavy or intimidating. Instead, there was a sense of understanding, a connection that had formed between her and the people who had been transformed by her playing. She took a slow breath and allowed herself to think, for the first time, about how far she had come to reach this moment. Her story was not one of sudden talent or luck. It had begun years ago in a small, quiet home where music was her constant companion. She had discovered the piano at an early age, fascinated by the way sound could move through the air and create something that felt alive. There were no formal lessons, no professional teachers guiding her hands, only a worn keyboard and the desire to explore the world of music on her own. She would spend hours after school, sitting in a corner of the room, practicing scales and simple melodies, learning to coax beauty from the instrument through patience and persistence. Every mistake was a lesson, every repetition a step forward, and she had grown to love the process as much as the music itself. Life had not been easy, and there were many moments when the piano had been both a refuge and a challenge. Responsibilities at home, financial struggles, and the need to help her family often took priority over her personal dreams. Yet she had never given up on the music. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the world seemed to hold its breath, she would return to the keys, letting her fingers find comfort and expression. Those hours were private, sacred, and filled with determination. No one had witnessed her practice. No one had heard the soft hum of her melodies drifting through the empty rooms. It was a secret part of herself, a personal sanctuary that had been nurtured in silence and solitude. Her work as a waitress had been another world entirely, demanding attention, patience, and energy in ways that music never did. She moved through the restaurant with care and precision, serving plates and refilling glasses, balancing trays and smiles with equal effort. The job required her to be seen and unseen at the same time, blending into the background while still maintaining a presence that allowed the restaurant to function smoothly. Guests often overlooked her, assuming she was just another part of the service, unaware of the dedication, skill, and passion that she carried silently. She had grown accustomed to this invisibility, finding satisfaction in her work and quietly holding onto her musical dreams. In the spaces between tasks, it was this combination of perseverance, hidden talent, and quiet resilience that had brought her to the piano that evening. When she had suggested she could play, it had been more than a spontaneous decision. It had been a culmination of years of preparation, though she had not fully realized it. The room, filled with the city's elite, seemed intimidating, but the piano offered a familiar comfort, a place where her identity was defined not by title or role but by skill and expression. Her fingers danced across the keys with confidence, each note carrying the weight of her experiences, the struggles she had faced, and the dreams she had nurtured in silence. As she continued to play, the young waitress thought of the lessons she had learned along the way. Discipline had been essential, not just in music but in life. She had learned to manage her time, to practice even when tired, to remain committed to her craft despite obstacles. Patience had been another key lesson, the understanding that growth was gradual, that mastery came from consistent effort rather than immediate recognition. And most importantly, she had learned the value of perseverance, the quiet determination to continue despite setbacks, to keep moving forward even when the world seemed indifferent to her talent. These lessons had shaped not only her musical abilities, but also her character, preparing her to face this unexpected moment in the restaurant with courage and grace. The guests, unaware of the depth of her journey, were captivated by the music itself. They responded to the emotional honesty, the skill, and the subtle complexity of the performance. Yet, every chord carried with it the silent echoes of her past, the private victories, and the moments of solitude that had built the foundation for this evening. The music spoke in a language that transcended words, conveying hope, resilience, and beauty to everyone in the room. It was a story without a narrator, a history expressed through melody and rhythm, and it resonated deeply with those who listened. The young waitress felt a profound connection to the audience as she played. She could sense their surprise, their admiration, and their emotional responses. Though she remained focused on the piano, each note was deliberate, each passage carefully considered. Yet she allowed herself to be guided by intuition and feeling. The music was not rigid. It flowed naturally, shaped by her understanding of emotion and expression. She played with a sense of freedom that had been cultivated over years of practice, allowing the piano to become an extension of herself and a bridge between her inner world and the audience. She thought of the nights spent practicing quietly, when exhaustion would threaten to take over, but determination kept her seated at the keys. She remembered the small moments of joy when a melody flowed perfectly, the quiet triumphs of mastering a difficult passage, and the resilience required to keep going despite mistakes and frustration. Those experiences had taught her to trust herself, to embrace the process of learning, and to find meaning in the journey rather than just the outcome. And now, in the presence of the audience, those lessons were being expressed through every note, every pause, and every subtle variation in the music. The audience began to show subtle reactions, their faces reflecting the emotional impact of the performance. Some leaned forward slightly, eyes wide with admiration, as if drawn into the music in a way they had not expected. Others closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them, allowing themselves to be moved by the delicate phrasing and expressive nuances of the piano. Even those who had initially been skeptical were caught in the spell of the music, their attention fixed on the young waitress and the story she was telling through her fingers. The atmosphere was electric with quiet wonder, a shared recognition of something rare and authentic unfolding before them. The manager, who had been tense and uncertain, now observed with a mix of respect and amazement. She realized that the young waitress had demonstrated not only technical skill, but also courage, authenticity, and emotional depth. The staff, too, were captivated, sharing glances of admiration and quiet pride in witnessing the unexpected brilliance of someone they had known only as a colleague. The performance had transcended the ordinary expectations of the evening, transforming the restaurant into a space of collective appreciation and emotional engagement. The young waitress, fully immersed in the music, felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond personal accomplishment. She had created a shared experience that touched the hearts of everyone present. As she continued to play, the young waitress allowed herself to reflect on the meaning of this moment. The music was no longer simply a performance. It was a culmination of years of dedication, patience, and resilience. It was a testament to the power of quiet perseverance, the value of nurturing one's talents even when recognition is absent, and the beauty that can emerge from consistent effort and passion. Every note she played carried a piece of her journey, an echo of the struggles and triumphs that had shaped her, and the audience responded with silent acknowledgement of the depth and authenticity of the experience. The emotional resonance of the performance grew with each passing moment. The young waitress felt a connection not only to the piano but to the people in the room. She could sense their emotional engagement, their curiosity, and their admiration. Even as she remained focused on the music itself, the audience was responding not just to the technical skill of the performance, but to the honesty and vulnerability expressed through the music. It was a reminder that art, in its truest form, has the power to bridge gaps, to connect people, and to convey meaning in ways that words alone cannot. The restaurant had become a space of shared experience, where the ordinary routines of service and dining had been replaced by something extraordinary and transformative. Guests were absorbed, attentive, and emotionally engaged, fully present in the moment. The young waitress, drawing on years of practice, discipline, and resilience, guided them through the narrative of the music, allowing each note to convey emotion and meaning. The piano was no longer just an instrument. It was a vessel for storytelling, a medium through which the audience could glimpse the depth of her character and the journey that had brought her to this point. As the piece reached its final passages, the young waitress played with a combination of strength and delicacy, carefully balancing the technical and emotional aspects of the music. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, each listener fully immersed in the experience. The intensity of the music swelled and then gently receded, creating a sense of resolution and completeness. When the final note lingered in the air, the silence that followed was profound, a moment of shared recognition and reflection that transcended applause and words. Then, slowly, the applause began. It was soft at first, tentative, but grew steadily, filling the room with appreciation and admiration. Guests rose to their feet, clapped with enthusiasm, and shared glances that conveyed a mixture of surprise, respect, and joy. The young waitress allowed herself a quiet smile, feeling the full weight of the moment. She had shared a part of herself that had been hidden for so long, and the response from the audience affirmed the power of her dedication, resilience, and talent. This performance, built on years of quiet effort and perseverance, had created a connection that would linger long after the night ended, a testament to the extraordinary possibilities that exist when passion and determination are allowed to shine. The room was alive with energy after the young waitress had finished playing. The sound of applause had slowly turned into standing ovation, and the guests who had been skeptical at first were now openly amazed. The initial disbelief that a simple waitress could command such presence and skill at the piano had vanished completely. Eyes shone with admiration, hands clapped with sincerity, and faces that were reserved now displayed genuine emotion. It was as though the performance had broken a barrier, allowing everyone present to experience a moment of pure wonder. The young waitress, still seated at the piano, allowed herself a small, humble smile, taking in the unexpected wave of recognition. Her fingers rested lightly on the keys, as if grounding herself after the rush of emotion and accomplishment. Guests began to approach her cautiously, some with cautious smiles, others with wide eyes, hesitant but eager to engage. Whispers of surprise and admiration filled the air. Fragments of sentences carried over from one table to another. "I didn't know she could play like that. She's incredible. I never would have expected this from a waitress." Each comment, though small, added to the realization that what had unfolded was extraordinary. People who had been strangers just moments ago now shared a collective memory, one that would remain vivid in their minds for years to come. The young waitress remained composed, polite, yet there was a warmth in her expression that reflected pride in her performance without arrogance. The manager approached, her expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. She had anticipated disaster, worried that the evening would be marred by embarrassment or disruption, and yet here was evidence that talent could be found in the most unexpected places. She offered a sincere nod, a gesture of recognition and newfound respect. The staff, who had been watching from the sidelines, also began to relax, their previous anxiety replaced by admiration and amazement. Even the kitchen staff peeked through doorways, sharing quiet smiles, unable to contain their pride in witnessing such a remarkable moment. There was a shift in the atmosphere, a tangible sense of unity and shared astonishment that transcended social expectations. Several guests, moved by curiosity and emotion, began to ask questions. They wanted to know about her training, her experiences, and the journey that had brought her to the piano that evening. The young waitress answered softly, her words humble and measured, revealing just enough to hint at the years of dedication, practice, and patience that had made such a performance possible. There were murmurs of admiration and astonishment as they listened, unable to fully comprehend how someone who worked in service had developed such mastery over the instrument. Yet, despite their surprise, the sincerity in her answers only enhanced their respect for her and the journey she had taken. A few influential figures in the room, people accustomed to wealth, privilege, and expertise, approached her with invitations and offers. They spoke quietly, their voices respectful and almost reverent. Some suggested opportunities for music lessons, auditions, or connections to professional circles that could further her talent. Others simply offered words of encouragement, praising her courage and skill. The young waitress listened politely, grateful but composed, understanding that these opportunities were not guarantees, but acknowledgments of what she had